Joining us now, John Pepall. He's the author of a new book called Against Reform, which is not something you hear every day of the week. Against Reform. So, John, we are going to start by reading an excerpt from your book and then go from there. Stand by. We have forgotten, you write, we have forgotten how and why our political institutions came to be. The media, academics, and politicians have a bias towards change. And the mass of people who are content with our institutions are quiet, while those keen on change will not be quiet. We are distracted by the spectacle of American politics. Most importantly, we misunderstand democracy and, in the hope of getting what we think the people want, risk the people losing control of government. Okay, let's amplify on that. What is wrong with the efforts to reform some of our more important institutions?
Well, I think that each of the ideas that I address in my book, and they're basically all the principal ideas that are out there, are bad ideas. That's just the way it happens to be. I can't think of any significant good changes that could be made to our political institutions, but I'm not closed-minded about it. It's just that as I saw things, as I was thinking about writing this book, there were several ideas out there, some things being enacted in provincial capitals or Ottawa that seemed to me to be bad, and I didn't see anybody taking them up, looking at them critically, which is what I wanted to do in the book. And I think, as I suggest in my introduction, that while these are separate issues, they stand and fall on their own. They can't be made a package because they're not actually entirely consistent, even though some people are for all of them. There's, as I say, a kind of bias, a kind of fundamental failure to understand our institutions as they are, and a kind of itch for some kind of fix for our political discontents by institutional change, rather than addressing the issues that divide us and trying to come to some understanding that will be effective in government and can be effective in government with our present institutions.
Okay, well, let's go through them. And I know all the rage these days are fixed election dates. We're having one here in the province of Ontario coming up in October. We've known for 4 years when the election was going to be. Fixed election dates fix a problem that doesn't exist, you say.
Yes.
How come?
Well, the idea behind fixed election dates is that governments, majority governments, can pick an election date arbitrarily or by consulting the oracles or whatever, and assure that they will do better because they have control over the election date. And in fact, this simply hasn't ever happened.
Well, it worked that way for 42 years in Ontario.
That's true that we have had, both in provincial capitals and in Ottawa in Canada, one government in power for a long time. But nobody actually, as far as I could find, has ever suggested that this was because people like Mackenzie King or Ernest Manning or Bill Davis shrewdly picked the right date every 4 or so years. There were long-term political ascendancies by one party in the provinces and in Ottawa, and in fact they could have had the elections any time they liked and would have won. As is the case of Jean Chrétien, most recently in Ottawa, there was not, if he had fixed election dates, he could have won the elections on any fixed election date.
So the timing wasn't as big an issue.
The timing was not an issue, and I didn't find, and I can't think from my knowledge of Canadian political history, that there has been any occasion where a government picked an election date shrewdly and won when otherwise it wouldn't have. And the one case where we know that a government picked an election date thinking that it would win handily, way before it had to, was David Peterson in 1990, and we know what happened to him.
He lost his government, he lost his own seat.
Yes, and
not the way he thought it would work out.
The party was out of power for 13 years. And to some extent, possibly people voted against Peterson, and they were largely voting against Peterson and the Liberals in that election, because they thought he was trying to pull a fast one. So if there is a risk without fixed election dates, there is a sanction in the hands of the voters to control that.
What about the notion, though, that The timing of an election is a power that ought not to belong to a first minister. It ought to belong to, if you like, the people. And the people should be able to count on when they can dispose of their governments, and if it's every 4 years, okay.
But you have to step back and understand, we don't have, what shall we call them, flexible election dates in parliamentary government, as we have it in Canada, by some oversight that nobody thought of fixing them, or because of some contrivance to give parties in power an advantage. We have them because governments and parliaments or legislatures cannot last any longer than a government having support of the Commons or the Assembly can continue to carry on the government.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, they have fixed terms for everything pretty well,
Yep.
because they have a completely different system of government. In Canada and in Westminster and in Australia and so on, we have flexible election dates, if we want to call them that, because the timing of an election depends on how long a government can carry on with the existing parliament.
But once this genie's out of the bottle, it's gone. We have fixed election dates now in Ontario, in BC, sort of federally, and we're not...
No, basically it's the same in all, I think it's 7 provinces, 1 territory, and Ottawa. That is to say, they all say that the Lieutenant Governor or the Governor General can still call an election whenever he or she sees fit. And we saw in Ottawa in the fall of 2008 that finally Harper decided to advise the Governor General to call an election, and she did. And there was briefly a little uproar and a lawsuit brought by Democracy Watch, which was turned down and has finally, leave to appeal has been refused at the Supreme Court of Canada. But it was all there obvious in the legislation from the get-go that while the legislation sets a date for the next election, it ain't necessarily so. And
Okay.
as we sit here today, we don't actually know when the next election for the House of Commons will be in Ottawa. It might be in the next few months.
Or not.
Or it might
Right.
still be, I think it's October of 2012, which is the next fixed date.
Gotcha. All right, let's do the next one, which is proportional representation versus first past the post, how we elect people. And you know there's been a great push by some folks in our country lately to make elections more so-called representative of what the public vote suggests. And I'm going to bring 3 graphics up right now just to indicate that. In the 2004 federal election, the NDP got 15.7% of the votes, but they only got 6% of the seats because of first past the post. In the 2000 federal election, conversely, the Liberal Party got not quite 41% of the vote, but managed to get 57% of the seats. And how about this one? 1987 in New Brunswick, they had a provincial election in which the Progressive Conservatives got 28.6% of the votes, and that translated into 0% of the seats. So, tell me in theory why parties shouldn't get seats in their respective legislatures based on the percentage of the total votes that they acquire.
Well, I'm inclined to reverse the question. Why should they? These figures are trotted out by the advocates of proportional representation as if they're astonishing and as if we thought we were going to get proportional representation, but the system isn't producing it. But nobody ever expected the system we have now to produce proportional representation. It's not for that purpose. And parties, what you have to do is go back and ask yourself, what is a party for? Parties emerged in a system such as we have now to bring together members of Parliament to support a government and to form a majority or an alternative majority in the opposition. And there is no point to a party. It doesn't serve any purpose in a political system if it hasn't that majoritarian vocation. And
maybe that's what some people object to. They feel their vote is wasted if they vote for a party that doesn't win.
Well, you may feel your vote is wasted if your candidate doesn't win, but the concept of a wasted vote is actually an artifact of proportional representation theory. The purpose of a party is to bring people together. We are electing individual representatives, and the parties are to bring them together. There's no reason why there should be proportionality between votes and parties, except if you accept the PR dogma. And as I suggest in my book, why are we saying that parties should have seats in proportion to their votes? Why don't we say that we should have policies in proportion to votes, or that people get to serve as mayor in proportion to the number of votes they get? The only reason that we have PR for parties is it can be done, and it is done in much of Europe. But it doesn't work. It produces elections in which there is no decision, in which the final decision on who governs is negotiated in the back rooms between parties, and the people effectively lose control of government because each election just produces a wodge of different parties, and there's no, for one thing, there's no proportion between the votes over the long term and the amount of time parties spend in power.
Well, here's how you put it in the book. Proportional representation necessarily breaks the connection between the voter and the member. Whether we voted for the winner or not, we all have our member of parliament. We know that, and perhaps more important, the member knows that, and will be solicitous of the voters to a fault. Our MP represents everyone in the riding, hoping to win over those who voted for someone else and fearing the loss of supporters from the last election. The MP, under PR, represents only the party voters. Why are you so sure that an MP elected through PR would represent the people any less than one represented through first past the post?
Because under PR, what happens is that the party, and while there are faces put on the party and candidates and so on, basically it's a list of candidates. The party is only looking for its little block of voters. And if you carry PR to its logical conclusion, and if you believe in PR you ought to, that can be as little as 1% of the voters.
But you can say the same thing for first past the post. If I got elected with 38% of the total votes and nobody else got as much as me, all I got to do is keep faith with that 38%. I can say the hell to you to the rest of you, and you're back in.
No, not at all. And actually, as we see constantly, there are large shifts in the votes between elections in our system and in Canada. And if you thought, well, I've got 30% of the votes, the other people are way behind me, I'm secure, I don't need to do anything, you'd very likely not win the next election.
Not that you don't have to do anything, but all I have to do is keep faith with those that put me there.
No, because the other 62% of the voters may coalesce around a broadly popular candidate.
Hard to do in a five-party system. Not impossible, but hard to do.
No, in practically speaking, in many of our ridings, it's a 2 or 3 party race. And indeed, of course, you know, the fifth party, if you want to call it that, well, I'm not sure which we should call the fifth party, but I'm going to call the Bloc the fifth party, is not even in the running in most places.
Well, there's some people would say that's a perfect reason to go to PR instead of first past the post, because you'd kill the Bloc. The Bloc ends up getting almost 50 seats in a House of Commons because their 8% of the vote nationally translates into, it's so efficient, translates into 50 seats.
But if in fact we went to PR, the Bloc might have fewer seats, but they'd have greater leverage in a House of Commons in which there would never be a majority, and there wouldn't even be a party close to a majority that could look to the support of one or another parties. The Bloc would find its leverage on government increased under proportional representation. There's no doubt of that whatsoever. And they would also be secure, even with their vote fluctuating and even with the resurgence of the federalist parties in Quebec, they'd be secure in whatever it would be, 30 or so seats on the basis of the support they have now.
How about the notion that we have become a very cleavage-based country because there are no Liberal seats ever in Alberta, there are very few Conservative seats in the major cities of this country, and the country would look less like a checkerboard map and it would be more, you know, multi-hued, I guess, or whatever. You know, if some Liberals won seats in Alberta, if some Conservatives won seats in Toronto or Montreal, if New Democrats won seats in rural Ontario, would that improve things?
No, I don't see why it would improve things at all. You know, political scientists, political commentators can look at the map and see that there is support for Liberals in Alberta, for the Tories in Toronto, and so the reality of the support out there is a known fact. But if the Tories want to take seats in Toronto, they're just going to have to make an effort, and the Liberals in Alberta. And historically, we've seen, of course, very different situations. About the time I was born, there used to be an expression, the Tory Toronto.
Yes. Things have changed.
Things have changed. Things will change again.
Okay, let me try this. I've heard people say, who cares how we elect them? The bigger question is what they do, how they act when they're elected. Do you agree with that?
How they act when they're elected, how they act in government.
Who cares if it's first past the post versus proportional representation? It's what they do when they get there is what really irritates people.
Our present way of handling things gives us a chance to hold them responsible, to turf them out, and particularly to turf out a government. What you get under proportional representation is that major parties are never out of power. If you look at the Christian Democrats in Italy under proportional representation, they were basically the government the whole time. All they did was shuffle around their partners a little bit.
Since World War II.
Yeah.
They've been the one party.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, well, until the 90s, and they made some changes. So, however fed up people may have been with the Christian Democrats, they were always there. And this is typical throughout Europe where they have proportional representation. A major party like the Christian Democrats is basically perpetually in power. Under our system, parties, which may have been popular for a while, they're in government for a while, they get lazy or maybe not corrupt, but a little self-serving or whatever, and we can get rid of them.
Okay, let me try Senate reform from you. Because I read in your book, I gather that at Confederation and then going forward, most provinces had upper unelected chambers, and slowly but surely, they all got rid of them, Quebec being the most recent in 1969. But the Canadian Senate prevails. It is still there. Are you therefore making the argument that we should get rid of the Senate as well?
Well, I get tweaked on this because I do seem to be suggesting a reform, namely the abolition of the Senate. It's not a practical suggestion because it would require a constitutional amendment, and we're not going to go there. My point in saying that is simply that as long as we have the Senate, people will make suggestions for its reform, in particular for electing it. And I think those are bad ideas. I think we should leave well enough alone.
Leave bad enough alone?
No, no. The Senate may not be a very popular institution or a very appealing institution. Perhaps it's more expensive than it need be. We don't have to pay the senators as much as we do. We don't have to give them the office services and expenses that we give them. But it's mostly harmless. And in fact, I found this in the course of researching my book. On subjects like fixed election dates, there was no intelligent debate, practically speaking, in any of the legislatures where it was passed or in Ottawa. The only intelligent discussion was in the Senate.
Okay, let me do a bit of a lightning round with you here. Elected senators, good idea, bad idea?
Very bad idea.
Bad idea. How about Mr. Harper's suggestion that senators be limited to 8-year terms?
Well, I suppose if they had to be elected, they should have a term like 8 years or whatever. But if they're not going to be elected, they should be able to serve till age 75, because at least if that's the case, then they acquire a certain independence. And by and large, of course, the senators stick to the party line, but they do acquire a certain amount of independence over the decades if they can serve that long. And that makes them more useful, more valuable.
I'll give the one example that everybody uses, but I'd like to hear your view on it. Patrick Brazeau is an Aboriginal Canadian who was appointed to the Senate, I think, at about the age of 35 or 36. That's a 40-year appointment.
Yes.
You don't mind that?
Well, I don't know him or much about him or anything, so whether it was a good appointment or a bad appointment, I can't say. I think he was appointed on the understanding that he would not serve that long, and what he will do when his notional term comes up, well, we'll see and we'll judge then, I suppose. If I were Prime Minister, I wouldn't appoint senators in their 30s. But it's allowed under the legislation, and I'm not suggesting we raise the age limit for senators.
Okay, let me try this with you then in our remaining moments here. If the status quo, you're against reform, according to the title of your book. If the status quo is so fabulous, how do you explain the widespread disaffection with politics in this country today?
Well, I think there are two things. One is, generally speaking, people have their ideas of what they want from government, what they don't want from government, and when they don't see themselves getting it, they think there's something matter with the institution. In fact, the problem is they're not winning the debates, or they're not opening their minds to the alternative ideas. So people are always unhappy with governments in some ways. What they need to do is stand up and fight for what they believe in and open their minds to the alternative ideas.
No politician can get a vote by saying, you know what, you just haven't persuaded me in the debate.
Well, it's not for politicians to do that so much. They have to appeal to the voters. But if the voters are discontented, they ought to try and grapple with the issue, stand up for what they believe in, keep their minds open, and so on. The other thing is basically Quebec. When you have a party with a block of seats, whether it's what they have now or what they would have under proportional representation, that doesn't believe in the country, obviously you're in a fix.
Right. You, I gotta say, for somebody who follows this as carefully as you do, I was surprised at how unconcerned you seem to be with the plight of the average member of Parliament who wants his or her job to be more meaningful, but can't make it so. Have I misread your thinking on that? 'Cause I don't think I have.
No, I think that the whining from members of Parliament about you know, they can't do anything and so on is disingenuous. They have a pretty influential job, and I know that they work a lot at it. I think that they could get by with working less at it and being paid less, actually. But I think it comes from a misconception of their role. They think that once they're elected to Parliament, they're going to be running the country like an American congressman, have a huge staff and be making up bills and all of that sort of thing. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And in the past, members of Parliament were quite content to go to Ottawa for a few weeks in the year, carry on some other business or profession, and have their say occasionally, cast their votes as they saw fit, and they were reasonably content.
That was a part-time job in those days.
It was a part-time job.
It sure is not anymore.
No, but I think that's a pity.
Last question. Philosophically speaking, how do you engage people? How do you storm the barricades championing the status quo?
Well, that's a bit of a problem, I guess. What you do is you write a book, and you get a lively cover for it, and you hope that people will pay attention to it.
Well, if they've made it this far in the interview, then they have. John, it's good of you to come in today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Against Reform, John Pepall. Appreciate your time.